So today I would like to speak about what is trauma, and I would like to speak about trauma and give a certain perspective, a spiritual kind of understanding of what trauma is. As I observed through the experience of many people who I happen to deal with, and so throughout life most of the people are traumatized one way or the other. And so we can have all kinds of psychological or scientific explanations of what trauma is. I'd like just to share my own perspective. So trauma is when we can't let go. And trauma becomes an insanity when we kind of keep or hold on to something for a very long time. So when we can't let go, we develop obsessive, compulsive disorders. We develop anxiety, because anxiety is that internal undercurrent. It's a current which is opposing the natural being. The natural being is that contentment, that peace, that higher frequency vibration of love that we're supposed to be connected usually within ourselves. Now the trauma that we experience at any point of our lives causes us to go into misalignment, and when we go into this misalignment, we basically hold on to the negative experience, the experience of loss, the experience of being somehow taken advantage of. But if you look at whatever experiences, whether it's a sexual abuse, whether it's any kind of abuse, it's after all is a loss of wholesomeness of the self, because the self has fragmented during that experience of abuse, during the traumatic situations, circumstances, experiences. So our soul kind of leaves its part with that experience, with that circumstances or people, with those circumstances or people. So in a way we lose our wholesomeness. So now the whole point of spiritual path, healing, evolution, so on and so forth, becomes about one and the same thing, is to restore the wholesomeness. But how do you restore the wholesomeness? Is by realizing the trauma, by realizing certain aspect of the self that is still in the past, it is not in the present. So when we say we cannot remain in the present, is because we've left a lot of these pieces of self in the past and we have never recollected them, we have never brought them back. So they became our undercurrents or shadows, if you will, that we have been constantly empowering from within. And because we've been constantly empowering them, they kind of gained a momentum, they have gained energy to exist within the space of our own consciousness, kind of as if on their own, because our consciousness has been focusing on these aspects of life. So we were focusing on things that we've lost. For example, you see insanity, like when we say, okay, this person is insane, this person does erratic things or actions. We usually think or observe these people being restless, being anxious, being very compulsive about certain things. For example, they lost someone or something, they start stalking them, or they start observing them, or coming somehow returning to the place. Even, if you observe thieves always return to the place of crime. Is because they want to, even though they've stolen something maybe tangible, a piece of themselves, or a piece of them, a piece of their own selves was or remained there in the past. That piece is that fear, that anxiety, that something has been lost energetically, but it hasn't been restored. And so again, if the person goes into crimes or into any kind of abnormal or immoral behaviors, it's because they feel compulsion to hold on to something. So once we lose something to the reality, we start being attached. We get into this trauma bonding or trauma cycle, which is bonding with the projected reality in a very unhealthy manner. That's why people who have trauma, experienced abuses, tend to go into addictive cycles where they need to hold on to something, or they tend to go into corrupt spirituality, abusive spirituality, or whatever, false spirituality, or they go into fanatic kind of religious fanatism, or some kind of fanatic paradigms. They become very obsessed about certain things, or even people who go into they become workaholics, or they become obsessed about success, business, money. It's not that they're actually obsessed about that. It's because they decided that that aspect of reality defines the meaning, defines or brings them completeness, because they could never restore this wholesomeness of their being internally. So they needed to create that obsession, that connection with the projected reality, where they would continuously go into the mode of needing partnerships to define them, needing substances, needing validations, needing approvals, needing some kind of a feeling of high or artificial contentment, even for a moment, to kind of at least artificially restore this sense of contentment and wholesomeness. So in a way, if we notice these patterns of behavior, and these patterns of behavior are all over, everyone has these patterns of behavior to a certain degree. Even if you consider yourself mentally, emotionally fine, you may be interacting with people who are not mentally, emotionally balanced, and so their imbalance causes imbalance in your being, causes friction in your field of consciousness, and this is already a kind of a traumatic experience. For example, people go into, they have relationships which break their heart, or break their, better to say, no one can break your heart, but your ego can be broken. Your sense of self, that wholesomeness, can be broken because of your own imbalances or imbalances of other people. But it doesn't matter whose imbalances cause the breakage. People who feel broken-hearted, people who feel that trauma of abandonment, become compulsive, become anxious, become restless, become obsessive about something or someone, because they left a part of them there with these people or situations. And until they bring themselves back by disconnecting, by cutting those energetic links to these situations, to these people, to the past in general, they will keep on dragging the chain of connections, of relationships, that with time will only get heavier, and with time will bring more disappointment, more repetitive scenarios where the trauma will become harder and harder to dissolve, or these traumatic circumstances will become harder and harder, because the lesson has not been understood. And the lesson is to untie oneself from the past through the practice of letting go. Trauma is inability to let go. A sage, a wise person becomes, let's say, a normal human being becomes a sage, becomes a wise person, because they cut off that chain. because they unbound, they untied themselves. That's the whole point of liberation. Because that bondage of the past no longer matters to them. Because they have come to peace with their past. They have realized the lessons. And the only lesson that we can realize is cutting off the connections, the cords with the past, with people, whatever that past represents. Cutting the links. The links are energetic. The links are mental and emotional. Because you may think you let it go, but your mind keeps on returning you to those moments. Your emotions keep on pulling you towards those circumstances. It means you haven't learned the lesson. When you restored your contentment, it means you let it go. The question is for how long? Because there are certain circumstances which will keep on reminding themselves, or will keep on coming back to your life, so that you can actually keep on working on yourself, going to the depth of that experience. Because maybe you're working with a recent heartbreak, but the reason of that heartbreak, the reason of that feeling of loss and low self-esteem, or whatever it brought up within you, goes back to your childhood. So the whole point of spiritual work is unraveling the trauma, unraveling these hidden undercurrents that do not allow us to live in the state of abundance. And the state of abundance is letting go. It's constant letting go. It's being in this process of constantly relaxed. Abundance, contentment, wholesomeness are one and the same thing, whatever the word you use. But the whole point of this being free or liberated consciously means being unbound from the external reality, not running away from external reality, but not having those energetic links that bind us to this projected reality, and thus staying in that liberated state all the time. Staying in the liberated state means that whatever you experience, you welcome it. You're grateful for every moment. Yet every moment you step out of that experience in a new moment, and that new moment is your clean slate. In that new moment, there is no past you, or nothing of the past. Maybe you have memories, but there are no energetic links. Energetic links means emotional response. So trauma is inability to let go, because trauma causes or is made of emotional responses. As long as we do have an emotional response to anything, we are bound. And now you may ask me, so do we have to become emotionless? We cannot fully become emotionless, but our connection with the reality on an emotional state balances out eventually to the point of freedom, where the external projected reality has no power over that wholesomeness, contentment, and bliss that we experience within. And again, we cannot say that traumatically caused dissociation is the same as spiritual liberation. Sometimes people may falsely take it for that, but unfortunately, sooner or later, life will bring up that traumatic response and shake up that dissociative state of the mind again, and pull it back into the emotional paradigm, where the person will feel hurt. Because the point of life is not to hurt us. The point of life is to invoke pain. And pain is the sign of imbalance. Pain is that energy, the stale energy that hasn't been transformed. So if you want to understand what the residue of trauma is, it is pain. And then with time, the more time passes, and the less we address this the trauma and the pain, the more it crystallizes, and it crystallizes into our body or within our body. When our body becomes deeply imbalanced, and certain diseases, certain issues manifest, and this becomes the way for our decay and eventual death. But this is not a real death. It's not an exit, a freedom of choosing to be in the body or not to be. Like most of the spiritual beings can choose. They can choose. That's what they are, spiritually evolved, because they've gained that freedom. The majority of people do not have that freedom. They don't have freedom of death, which means liberation, freely exiting out of the body, because the trauma binds them to that body and kind of binds them to the experience of rotting alive, of suffering that pain on and on and on through time. It crystallizes into a disease. First it's a mental emotional pain, then it crystallizes also through the lifestyle. The lifestyle only enhances. The lifestyle itself cannot cause disease, but together as a combination with the emotional and mental unresolved trauma, it causes incurable diseases, issues that eventually lead us to decaying, to aging, to death. Unnatural death, the death of agony and pain. Because this pain shows us the path to liberation, but because we are not taught to work with pain, to understand that the pain shows us imbalance, pain shows us the door to our trauma, that trauma or corruption, distortion of consciousness that has been shaped through the down cycle, through many lives, incarnations, different scenarios, and now as we wish to ascend, as we wish to evolve, as we wish to refine and heal, there's no other way but look back in a contemplative way in order to work with these traumas, in order to work with this past baggage in a detached manner, so that we can finally learn a simple lesson of letting go and being. And through this being, all our actions become balanced and, permeated with wisdom. Otherwise, all our actions are driven by our traumas. How? Because it is the trauma that creates anxiety, restlessness, obsessions, compulsive actions, emotionally driven actions, unhealthy emotions, not healthy emotions. Even healthy emotions of joy, let's say, they don't last because they can't last. Because we are pushed by these undercurrents within ourselves that keep on creating negative scenarios so that this pain and trauma will be invoked. Our own consciousness creates these scenarios because it tries to rid itself of these negative undercurrents that do not allow it to dwell within itself in a peaceful and wholesome manner. So the whole point of spiritual work lies in understanding this process. And whatever concepts we hear, let go, feel this, feel that, we can't understand it as long as we are driven by trauma, as long as our life is just soaked in trauma. All we know about life is the traumatic response. That's why we can say that when we awaken, we are born again, because now we perceived life in a different manner. We perceived life as a wholesome being, and now through this wholesome being we can observe our imbalances and traumas, and we can admit them to ourselves. We no longer live in illusion of that kind of corrupt life, that the corrupt life, that the suffering that we experience is normality, because we've understood that it is not. Simply because we have awakened to that being, yet that awakened being is not a guarantee that you're capable of going through whatever it takes to dissolve these traumas, to dissolve these unhealthy emotional responses. And for that purpose, you need guidance. Guidance from within and guidance from without. This process takes time, and that's why we have to be just prepared and embrace our life as it is at this point with an awakened perspective, with gratitude and realization that life is not against us. Again, the traumatic response is to perceive life as if it's against us. But now, the awakened perspective gives us an understanding that this life is nothing but our own emanation, our own extension. And what we have right now is the extension of our trauma. And whatever the circumstances, situations, and relationships are but the reflections of that. And so we have to make an attempt to realize the deeper roots of this manifestation. And these roots are within. Whatever pain we experience as a response to the circumstances, situations, should give us a clue, should help us to humble down and develop natural gratitude to life, because this life is the very emanation of our consciousness that is trying to evolve and break through from its own limitations, from its own karmic down cycle, accumulated limitations, distortions, and corruption. And that's why it has created this body, so that this body can be its radar, its navigation system, to understand how to rid itself of trauma, of corruption. And the system, how we know that we experience trauma, is pain, the feeling of suffering, or in other words, whatever pain, mental, emotional, physical pain. It indicates us that we are unwholesome, that we continue following the paths of trauma, the paths of corruption, rather than the true path. And once we start dissolving trauma, our life comes to the straight line of existence, simple yet very fulfilling and abundant, full of bliss and wholesomeness. Thank you.